When you're studying UX or when you work in the field, you start to hear a lot of different terms and terminology for different things that we do in the field, or different ways of describing some of the things that we're talking about in these courses, and it can be a little bit confusing. A lot of those terms that you might hear, whether it's human-computer interaction or interaction design or user experience research or usability engineering or human factors, a lot of those come from different parts of the history of UX and how it's evolved over time. So I thought it would be useful in this lecture to just take you through the history of UX, one version. I'll say at the outset, this is a very brief, very incomplete history, very much from my perspective. If you asked 10 different people in the UX field about the history of UX, you'd probably get 15 different stories. So there's a lot of different ways that this story can be told. But hopefully this will be useful for at least putting into perspective how we got where we are today. And where I want to start this story is back in the early 80s, which is when the field of human-computer interaction was first getting started. And the thing to realize about this period in time is that this was the beginning of the personal computing era, the PC era, where we were starting to see for the first time non-programmers using computers. So before this, you had things like the graphical user interface, point and click interfaces, devices, or computers like the Apple Macintosh. Pretty much the only people that were using computers were highly trained professionals that had gone through a lot of education to be able to write programs for the computers. They knew a lot about how computers work. They memorized very arcane commands that they would type into these devices to get them to do what they wanted. And now all of a sudden, in the late 70s and the early 80s, this world of computing was opening up to a vast array of other types of users. These might be secretaries who were doing a lot of word processing, or people who were entering information into inventory databases, and various other types of users. And the question was, how can we design, how can programmers or people who are computer experts design software for these non-programmers to use? And a lot of people in the fields of computer science and psychology started thinking really hard about this question, thinking about whether there were principled ways to design these types of systems. And a landmark in this story was the publication in 1983 of a book called The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction. It was written by Stu Card, Tom Moran, and Alan Newell. And this had a big impact on bringing that field of HCI together in those early days, because it was the first attempt to really say that we can scientifically and rigorously use what we know about humans, about human psychology, about human perception, about human cognition, and how people work to design systems that will work for them. Around the same time, a community of people was coming together and starting to identify as a community that was interested in studying these types of problems. So in 1982, we had the first CHI conference, and CHI is the premier conference in the field of human-computer interaction. The long name is the Association for Computing Machinery's Conference on Human Factors in Computing, but everybody in the field calls it CHI. The first conference happened in 1982, and it's still going strong today. So here's a picture from 2016 in San Jose, California. There were 4,000 people in attendance there, and as you can see from this picture I took of a conference session I was trying to get into, it's just overflowing and filled to capacity. So the Card, Moran, and Newell book and the beginning of the CHI conference was the beginning of the academic community that was coming together to study these issues of human-computer interaction. And that's the term that we use for the academic field that studies the way that people interact with computing technology and how we can design better systems. But at the same time, a professional practice started to emerge in the 1980s. However, it was very closely tied to that academic community in the early days, because the only way that you could really learn about what was going on in the field of HCI was to go to the CHI conferences, or maybe you could take one of a handful of HCI graduate courses that were sprinkled around in universities in the U.S. and elsewhere, mostly in computer science and psychology departments. But there wasn't, a degree that you could get, or there wasn't a course of study that you could pursue that would just be about HCI. Towards the end of the 1980s, we started to see a handful of books come out that were aimed at a wider audience, that were aimed at professional practitioners and other people that were interested in some of these issues around human-computer interaction. So in 1986, we had User-Centered System Design by Don Norman and Norm Draper, which was the first book to really articulate this idea of user-centered design that's still very much at the center of UX practice today. In 1987, Ben Schneiderman came out with Designing the User Interface, which was the first textbook of human-computer interaction that was meant to be used in university courses to teach this stuff. And in 1988, Don Norman published The Psychology of Everyday Things, later republished under the name The Design of Everyday Things, which was a very influential book that reached beyond the community of HCI, that introduced a lot of these ideas to a wider public and became very important in promoting this field outside of its smaller origins. But in terms of the way that human-computer interaction was incorporated into system design during this period of time, is that usability was primarily seen as the main factor of concern, and it was seen as a software engineering issue. And so you had usability testing starting to be performed as part of software development, but it was often performed at the end of the development to validate the product and say, yes, this is ready for release. But it would be done very late and much too late often to really influence the design of the product in the first place. And user interface design, or UI design, was often used as a way to put a pretty face on software whose functionality was pretty much already determined. So a UI designer would come in at the end and sort of decide where the buttons should go and which buttons there should be and what the labels on those buttons should be and maybe what some of the graphics should be, but they wouldn't have very much influence on the functionality of the software, because that would have already been determined by the software engineers who were working earlier in the process. So flash forward to the 1990s, and a big sea change was starting to happen that was going to influence the way that this field evolved going forward. And a couple of key time points in this big change were, first of all, in 1988, the World Wide Web was invented by Tim Berners-Lee, essentially provided a specification to allow pages to be linked to each other to make it very easy to share information on the internet. It wasn't until 1991 that what we now consider to be the first web page was actually published by Tim Berners-Lee. And one thing that's interesting, when you look at this original web page, the statement in here, everything there is online about the World Wide Web is linked directly or indirectly to this document. So that was a very different era than we have now, with billions and billions of web pages and really no way to make sense of everything that's out there. Another milestone in this progression was the release in 1993 of the Mosaic web browser. So while the World Wide Web existed before this and there were web pages out there, there was not really a convenient, user-friendly way for people to access it. The Mosaic browser came along and made it much easier for people to access the web, to follow links and go to different places, and also to be able to see images for the first time in a way that was convenient and integrated with the page layout. A huge milestone occurred in 1995 when the National Science Foundation, who was in charge of administering and governing the internet, changed a rule to allow internet commerce to go forward. And very shortly after that, Amazon.com released one of the first major online stores that had a big impact. And you can see on this slide the original version of Amazon. It looks pretty different now. But that opened the floodgates to lots of companies and lots of different other types of organizations suddenly becoming very interested in the potential of the internet. And so you saw a lot of investment, you saw a lot of activity, and ultimately that led a few years later to what we refer to now as the dot-com bubble, which was a huge explosion of e-commerce websites and different types of businesses getting onto the internet and trying to figure out how to make that something that could be profitable and could provide different types of services to people. And so suddenly, in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot more people were dealing with this stuff. We're interacting with computers to do a lot more different types of things. So a lot more companies were getting involved, both new companies and existing companies. A lot more users who hadn't really had a reason to interact with computers before were using computers to do a lot more stuff. So here's a graph that really illustrates how dramatic the rise of the internet was during this period. So if you look at 1995, the year that internet commerce was first allowed, when Amazon was founded, you can see that the bar is so small on this graph that you can barely even see it. You go forward a little bit even to about 2000, and you're already looking at hundreds of millions of users, which pales in comparison to the number of users today, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 billion, or roughly half the world's population. And you can see why companies and other organizations who were interested in reaching users and consumers would have started really paying attention to this phenomenon and starting to figure out how to get involved in it. And so in that early era of the dot-com bubble, you saw a huge growth in the number of jobs in the technology sector, specifically around the creation and the evolution of these websites. And so you saw lots of software engineering jobs, but you also saw thousands of new web designers that were getting into the field and trying to figure out what's the best way to design websites to reach consumers and to meet these business needs. And so it became clear during this time as well that user interface design and usability engineering, the way that it had been done as part of the software engineering process, wasn't really enough to capture some of the dynamics of what was happening and what people were trying to do with the internet. So a term that became popular that was discovered by the web design community around this time was this concept of interaction design. Well, interaction design was a term that was actually coined in the mid-1980s by these two gentlemen, Bill Verplank and Bill Moggridge, both of whom were industrial designers by training, and they were trying to describe how industrial designers who had traditionally worked with physical products that might be things like furniture or appliances were starting to have to deal with this notion of interactivity as software was starting to move into those products. Well, people in the web design field picked up this term and started to use it to describe what they were doing because it gave them a way to capture the shift beyond user interface design, beyond this just putting the pretty face on the product at the end of it, beyond usability engineering, beyond this idea of just testing the product at the end, but actually getting involved earlier in the process in deciding what the interaction should be and how these things should go together. Also beyond human-computer interaction as a way of differentiating the professional practice from the academic research field that was studying the way that humans and computers interacted. And also beyond some of the other fields that were feeding into this phenomenon of web design. So a lot of people were coming to this not necessarily from the background of human-computer interaction, but from graphic and industrial design and other places, and they were looking for a way to describe what they were doing that made sense to them as well. And also beyond software engineering, to differentiate the discipline of interaction design from the discipline of software engineering, or to distinguish between deciding what the product should be and how it should work from the process of building it and validating that it does work as it should. A second shift was just on the horizon, though. So you can see that in 1985, right around the beginning of the personal computing era, a very small percentage of households had a computer in the house, so 13%. By 2000, that number was up to 44%, but it's still less than half of the households had access to a computer in the home. Go forward to 2014, just a couple of years ago, and pretty close to all of the households in the developed world have access to a computer. So what we can see from this is that computing technology and interacting with computers is moving out, very much out of the workplace and into people's everyday lives and starting to be used for the things that people do: shopping, education, entertainment, and all kinds of things that are not workplace related. So that was one shift that was happening. And another dramatic example of the diffusion of computing technology into people's everyday lives can be seen through this graph of the adoption of mobile phones, which really grew quite dramatically throughout the aughts, to the point where you can see in 2014 that there were 120 mobile phones per 100 inhabitants, meaning that people on average own more than one mobile phone. And you compare that to 1997, where it was barely a fifth of the population had access to these types of technologies. So that was another really dramatic shift. And that caused a shift in the way that companies started to think about the way that they could use technology and the way that technology facilitated their interaction with their users and with their consumers. So you saw another shift from websites to these new forms of interacting with consumers and with users in the forms of apps and services, moving on towards new types of devices and all kinds of different ways that this was changing. And so what characterizes this latest shift in the way people interact with technology is that we really see computing as a way of life, not a special activity that people do sometimes. In some sense, we're always connected, or we're almost always connected, and those connections are part of every aspect of our lives, not just sort of isolated to things that we do at work or things that we do at school. And from a business perspective, businesses started to see computing as part of an ongoing relationship with customers. So not just a matter of publishing a site or shipping a product, but a way of maintaining an ongoing relationship through perhaps multiple products and multiple sites and multiple apps and multiple services that were being provided. And so we saw a merging of usability and interaction design with other concerns that had previously been separate. So with things like marketing and branding, with market research. So now insights from market research were being blended with insights from usability research and user experience research. A merging of these user experience or user-centered perspectives with product strategy. So, not just being brought in at the end to provide a pretty face or to provide usability testing to validate something, but actually being brought in at the beginning to figure out what should we be building, what should we be making, and how should we be reaching people. And also increasingly a merger of usability and interaction design with physical design as we start to move off of the web and into mobile platforms and wearables and the Internet of Things and all kinds of other forms of technology. And fundamentally, what we've seen throughout this phase of the history of user experience is a recognition of user experience as a central concern for products and brands and enterprises. So it's no longer a peripheral concern or an afterthought, but often a central concern that is essential to the success of these enterprises. And so user experience today, as I said, is now seen by many firms as strategically important. User experience shares a common set of concerns and basic approaches, but we're also seeing that there's an increasing degree of specialization within the field. And this is a topic that we could go into great depth on, but I'm just going to kind of give a sense of it. And so one of the splits that we see, or one of the ways that people often specialize, is to specialize either in UX research or UX design. And there's plenty of people that do a fair amount of both. But even within those specializations, we're starting to see subspecialization. So within UX research, you have people that specialize in qualitative UX research that primarily do interviews and ethnographic observations, and people that specialize in quantitative UX research that are maybe more concerned with analyzing large data sets of analytics and clickstream data. And on the design side, you see people specializing in different aspects of the design chain. So specializing in visual design or kind of the more graphical aspects of the presentation versus interaction design, figuring out how all of the different pieces fit together, or information architecture, what's the best way to present information, large volumes of information to users. And then sitting on top of this, you have sort of the more overarching specializations of things like project management, user experience, strategy, and so forth. So when we try to put it all together, it can look pretty messy. So here's an example of a diagram that tries to put together all of the different concerns that feed into this notion of user experience design and user experience research. And you can see that this diagram tries to capture the relationship between user experience design and interaction design and human-computer interaction in marketing, in information architecture. And you could draw this diagram 1,000 different ways, and it probably wouldn't get very much clearer than this. But the really important thing is that in a nutshell, the history of UX, however you look at it, really is the history of user-centered design, of putting the user at the center of the design process and making decisions about how to design products with the user in mind. And over time, that user-centered focus has become more and more central to the way a lot of products are being designed, which is great. The terminology changes, but the focus remains on the user. And it also evolves to incorporate new things as we move along. So incorporating physical design and marketing and big data analysis and all kinds of other things that have become sort of brought into the UX fold. Specialization is common, as I mentioned, especially now with a large and growing industry, but it's important to be knowledgeable about the big picture, to understand all of these different aspects of UX, even if you're only going to spend most of your time doing one of them, because you need to know how they all fit together. And another important thing to get out of this is that user experience is increasingly important to business and really to everything that we do. And a final important point is the world needs more UX experts. And so I hope that you will be one of them.